and welcome to today's installment of the De La Salle Sustainability Lecture Series. My name is Ari Sobando. I'm the Assistant Dean for Research of the Gokongwei College of Engineering at De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines. I have the distinct pleasure of hosting this morning's session. But before we proceed, let us have a brief prayer.
Let me be the change I want to see, to do with strength and wisdom all that needs to be done, and become the hope that I can be. Set me free from my fears and hesitation.
I would like to acknowledge the presence of Chancellor Emeritus Dr. Carmelita Quebenco. Good morning, ma'am. To provide a background about the La Salle Sustainability Lecture Series, a video was prepared by Dr. Raymond Artan, the Vice President for Research and Innovation of De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this month's edition of the Sustainability Lecture Series. This lecture series is a joint initiative of the International Association of La Salle Universities, or IALU, and De La Salle University. The series was launched in January 2021 to provide a platform to share sustainability-related initiatives done by different resource persons and teams in the different institutions that make up the global IALU network. Nearly 4 years on, this lecture series is still going strong. And the initial team, consisting of Professor Dr. Kathleen Aviso, the current Dean of the Gokongwei College of Engineering, Professor Dr. Alvin Colaba, the Director of the Center for Engineering and Sustainable Development Research, Chancellor Emeritus Dr. Carmelita Quebenco, and myself has since grown, and part of the team now includes Professor Dr. Aris Ubando of the Gokongwei College of Engineering, our former PhD student and faculty member at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, Dr. Maria Victoria Nigo Sumagang, and the entire team of the University Sustainability Office of the LSU, led by Executive Director Antonio Nonoy Maralit. This lecture series is envisioned to continue to provide a platform for our joint work, inspired partly by St. Francis's Laudato Si encyclical in 2015, coupled with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Understanding our joint stake in the future and the challenges that face sustainable development, it is incumbent upon the global LaSallian community to share our knowledge and expertise and help drive green growth, not just within the LaSallian community, but for the entire planet as well. Thank you, and I hope you find today's lecture to be very stimulating. Have a good day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tan. Now that we have already a background of the LaSalle Sustainability Lecture Series, we are incredibly fortunate today to delve into a topic of increasing global importance: the intersection of climate justice and its impact on driving meaningful climate action and policy support. Climate justice, as we know, is becoming a more and more prominent concept in how we communicate and advocate for climate change solutions. However, a crucial question remains: how well is this concept understood by the public, and how widely does it resonate across different groups? Today, we have a privilege of exploring these questions. Our esteemed speaker will present a compelling discourse on climate justice and share insightful findings from a global study. This research sheds light on the powerful links between people's beliefs about climate justice and their engagement in climate action, as well as their support for crucial climate-related policies. Drawing on the psychological perspective, the lecture will also underscore the significant value of climate justice as a motivating force for climate action, spanning diverse geographic contexts. Furthermore, we will have the opportunity to understand the critical role of the Philippines within the broader landscape of climate justice discourse and action. It is now my distinct honor to introduce our speaker for today, a leading expert in this field, Dr. John Jamir Benson R. Aruta. Dr. Aruta is an associate professor at our very own De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines. Before returning to DLSU, he held the position of senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology at Sunway University in Kuala Lumpur. As an interdisciplinary researcher, Dr. Aruta's impressive research program encompasses several vital areas, such as the application of psychological principles to foster environmental sustainability, a crucial interface between climate change and mental health, particularly within the global south context, planetary health, and the mental health of often neglected and marginalized populations. His commitment to advancing the field is evident in his role as one of the founding associate editors of the Journal of Global Environmental Psychology, a pioneering publication supported by the Leibniz Institute in Germany, which provides open access to high-quality environmental psychology articles. He also serves on the editorial board of the BMC Psychology and the prestigious Nature journal, Communications Psychology. Further, demonstrating his leadership, Dr. Aruta is the founder and director of the Sustainability Psychology and Planetary Health Research Laboratory. He also contributes his expertise as a member of the advisory board and steering committee of the Global Forum on Humanitarian Health Research, an initiative by the Forgery International Center and National Institute of Health of the USA. Dr. Aruta's exceptional contribution to science have been recognized with numerous accolades, including being the Outstanding Young Scientist in 2023 by the National Academy of Science and Technology. He was also awarded the prestigious Alfredo Lagmay Award for Psychological Research by the Psychological Association of the Philippines. Notably, based on the rankings by Stanford University, Dr. Aruta is listed among the top 2% scientists across the globe. Beyond his significant academic achievements, Dr. Aruta is also deeply committed to bridging the gap between research and practice for the past decade. He has been actively working on the ground in the Philippines as a clinical practitioner, providing invaluable mental health assessment, counseling, and psychotherapy for families, children, adolescents, and early adults. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. John Jamir Benson R. Aruta.
Thank you very much, Professor Aris Obando, for the warm introduction and welcome. Before I start, I also want to thank Professor Kay Avisa and Professor Raymond Tan for the invitation to be in this lecture. It is really a pleasure, and I'm very excited because it's the Lasallian Sustainability Lecture, and I was very looking forward to having this discussion because I really enjoy an interdisciplinary space. So for this presentation, I will be talking about mainly on climate justice beliefs, which is a very psychological construct, and the emerging research on how such beliefs can be a driver of climate action and policy support around the world. And I have an outline, but I'd like to share first about how my research program relate to the SDGs. As Professor Arias mentioned, I'm an environmental psychologist, and basically what I do is how I trick people's brain to behave more sustainably. And I apply these psychology principles in many aspects of environmentalism, and that's directly related to SDG 12. Part of my research is how to translate climate change emotions into climate action, which is related to SDG 13. Without action, we cannot really address the issue of climate change. And I'm a mental health professional, and I find the opportunity to look at how climate change is interconnected with mental health, and that's directly related to good health and well-being, SDG 3. And because of my background and personal experiences, I have been deeply committed to reducing inequalities, and part of my research program and advocacy is to reduce inequalities caused and perpetuated by climate injustices and many different forms of climate injustices. I show this slide very quickly just so you know where I'm coming from when I present the next slides. In the next slides, what you'll see is a quick introduction of environmental psychology, my field, because I understand this is a predominantly hard science crowd. If I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, but also there's some level of interdisciplinarity. And so I thought it might be worth it, to explain environmental psychology 101. I'll talk about climate justice. I'll present the study. I'll talk about some implications and some practices and initiatives that we've been doing related to the topic, and hopefully we can talk about your questions. Basically, environmental psychology is an interdisciplinary field. We are very interested on how humans interact with their environment, may it be natural or um, social environment. You see on the picture on your left is deforestation. This is obviously human caused. This is caused by human behavior, and an example of how humans can shape their environment. You can see on the right side of your screen is an elevated house, which is a human response to flooding. An example of how the environment can shape in turn human behavior. This basically is what I do. I study this intricate intersection between the environment, human behavior, human emotions, and human conditions. And environmental psychology has been neglected in the environmental domain as a social science, despite its importance in addressing huge global issues, including environmental problems. We know that many of the environmental problems, almost all of the environmental problems that we experience, are not natural disasters or problems. Much of them are anthropogenic or human caused. Psychology, as a field that focuses on behavior, is very well placed to contribute to be one of the puzzle pieces in addressing these seemingly insurmountable anthropogenic problems. And you can see here in the graph, since industrialized period, global warming has substantially increased, indicating that it is indeed based on human action at an aggregate level. I'm just going to show you some of in the next 2-3 minutes, some examples of studies that we do in environmental psychology. For example, we are studying how natural environment impact how we think and how we process information. In this study, for example, they looked at how natural environment, meaning nature, exposure to nature, versus exposure to buildings or built environments can influence children's processing of information, how quick they are when they process this cognitive test or intellectual test. For example, in this study, they exposed children to the natural environment for 30 minutes to 1 hour. And then there's another group of children exposed to built environments for 30 minutes to 1 hour. And then after that, they gave them an IQ test that measure reaction time, meaning how fast you process information when you answer IQ test items correctly. So you can see here that children who were exposed to the natural environment, when they answer correctly the IQ test, they answered very fast because the milliseconds is much shorter than the milliseconds of children who were exposed to the built environment. Children who were exposed to built environment, when they answer correctly, they're relatively slower when they process information, indicating the nature benefit, the cognitive benefit of natural environment. In psychology, we're very interested in personality, how different we are as a person, how unique we are as a person. I had the privilege to publish studies that talk about how goodness in one person, being a good person, can be a driver of environmental concern and ecological behaviors. I will not labor you with the details, but basically personality differences on how good you are as a person transcends individual level concern, but it actually reaches environmental level concern. And we are also studying in my field our cognitive biases. We have many ways of thinking, and often the way we think, we often are biased. Often we are not aware that we have these biases. So for example, if there's a threat or environmental threat, many of us would think that the threats are very far from us and it's less likely to affect us for many different reasons. One of the reasons is because we have cognitive biases. We have what we call psychological distance, where we feel very distant from the threat. Temporal distance is a cognitive bias when you are likely to think that the disaster is more likely to happen in the future than it is today, even though we know climate change and other environmental problems already are damaging people's lives. Social distance is the cognitive bias where we think that disasters or threats are more likely to happen to other people than people like you, like us, even though we have the same levels of vulnerabilities. Geographical distance is when we mistakenly think that disasters and threats are more likely to happen to places far from us or from our communities, when in reality it's actually already damaging us. Cognitive biases are very dangerous in the environmental domain because with this bias, we are less likely to act. For example, in this very cool um, it's a study, this is also about climate change belief. They looked at the climate change beliefs of people living close to the coast in New Zealand. So they measured how close your house is from the coast and how far some houses are from the coast, and they correlated that with the extent to which people believe in climate change. And what they found is that when people live closer to the coast compared to people live farther from the coast have greater beliefs that climate change is anthropogenic, that it is already happening. They also control for the elevation of the house because you may be living beside, near the coast, but if your house is very elevated, then you're less likely to be threatened by disasters. So after controlling for house elevations, they still found the same pattern. But this is just to point out that there's a huge role of psychology in how we process climate change information, how we act pro-environmentally, and how we engage in climate action. And at this point, let me focus on the subject matter, which is climate justice. Climate justice is a very difficult concept to define. Your definition of climate justice may depend on where you are in your climate justice experience and climate justice discourse. But one very rough definition of climate justice is who or which country mainly causes climate change and who are hurt the most due to climate change. In my work, I represent a very global south perspective. You see here on your screen, countries highlighted with red are roughly described as global south countries. Often they are developing countries. Often global south countries have very minimal contribution to greenhouse gas emissions historically. And often global south countries are colonized countries. Global north countries, on the other hand, are countries you see highlighted with blue. Often they are highly developed countries, and historically, the major driver of greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to climate change. And often these are countries that colonized other global south countries. So this is very important context. And another important context is if you look at the CO2 emitting countries since we industrialize as as a global community, you'll see that historically it is the United States who has been the top emitting country in the world, along with other global north countries, and of course with the exception of China and India that are global emerging economies. But despite the minimal contribution of global south countries, you will see that they are the most vulnerable to the disasters brought about by the climate crisis. You can see here in the World Risk Report in Asia, in particular, our region, Southeast Asia, is one of the most vulnerable to disasters that include anthropogenic disasters such as climate change. You will see that
Okay, I think we lost Dr. Aruta, so let's wait for a while he tries to reconnect.
Increasing taxes on carbon intensive foods, additional charges for people who fly more than twice a year. And we asked them, these are some initial findings. We asked them about their climate justice awareness and knowledge by country. You see here that we asked them before today, have you ever heard of the term climate justice? You see that there's small percentage, but there's high percentage of climate justice awareness in India, in UAE, but relatively less than 40% in most countries. We also asked them how much they know about climate justice, and you will see lower knowledge in general on climate justice, relatively higher in India and UAE. Philippines, 23.5% said they have heard or they know about climate justice. And I want to point out that we measured climate justice beliefs who agree on the items on climate justice beliefs. You will see that in the Philippines, for example, I want to highlight this. For example, 83% of respondents from the Philippines believe that climate change affects those people in poverty more severely or disproportionately. No, that we need to redistribute resources, from wealthy countries to poorer countries in the name of climate justice, etc. But let me skip this and go to the main finding. We also look at predictors of climate justice awareness. We found that younger people are more likely to believe in climate justice or be aware of climate justice. Education is related to climate justice awareness. Political orientation, a more left-wing political orientation, is related to climate justice awareness. When you are informed of climate change and you experience climate change firsthand, you are more likely to be aware of climate justice. There are sources of information where people seek climate change information. For example, we found that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, books, magazines, science journals, talking to families and friends predict awareness, knowledge, and climate justice beliefs to varying extent. And the main finding is that it answered the question, do climate change beliefs influence climate action, online activism, pro-environmental behavior, and policy support? We did a hierarchical linear modeling, and when we found that overall, yes, climate change beliefs positively predict climate action, meaning people who believe on climate justice, they are more likely to engage in climate action, in climate online activism. They're more likely to be pro-environmental in their behaviors, and they're more likely to push for policies supporting climate change mitigation and adaptation. And interestingly, we looked at country differences. So we have established that climate change beliefs predict climate action. But are they different across countries? What we found is that in terms of the prediction of climate justice beliefs on climate action, there's not a lot of differences across countries. They are similar in the strength of the relationship. But in terms of pro-environmental behavior and its relationship with climate change beliefs, pay attention that countries like the Philippines, Nigeria, and the Netherlands, the relationship between climate change beliefs and pro-environmental behavior are weaker. That's also the same in terms of online activism. Philippines, India, and Japan, although climate change belief is related to online activism, the relationship is much weaker in the Philippines, Nigeria, and Japan, meaning that even though they will believe in climate change, it always doesn't relate to their action, in person or online. there's also a relationship between climate change belief and support for policies, but the relationship is substantially weaker in the Philippines, Nigeria, and the Netherlands, and very strong in Australia, US, and UK. So, in simple words, I'm aware of the disciplinary differences. So, in simple words, the takeaways would be that public awareness of climate justice as a concept is generally low around the world, with an exception of UAE, and India. And despite the low levels of climate justice awareness, climate justice beliefs about how disproportionately the impacts are, the representation in high level discourse, the role of colonialism and capitalism, and the wealth needs to be redistributed, appear to be widely endorsed across countries. The climate change beliefs predict climate action, pro environmental behavior, online activism, and policy support, but there are cross country differences with the degree of the relationship. And the influence of climate justice beliefs was stronger generally in rich and historically high greenhouse gas emitting countries and weaker in developing countries. And since this is a Philippine audience, I want to highlight some of the explanations. We have no data yet about how they actually relate, but these are only potential explanations. We know that activism in the Philippines is literally deadly. We have the most number of climate activists killed, murdered, in the name of environmental and climate activism. We are number one in Asia. We are top three around the world. And we know there are many people who would not engage in active climate activism because of this threat. There are also, if you want to see articles that I publish on environmental defenders, we have published one paper in the Lancet, and I publish on their mental health in this journal, Loss of Trauma. We also know that climate information campaign hardly increases climate action because of misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. Culture may be also a factor here because we don't always act based on our internal drives, but because of cultural considerations. We also know that you know we don't always attribute the disasters to climate change and human action. Often we attribute this to external factors. We also need to reflect on how we can meaningfully integrate climate change into basic education. We know that we have done this already in the past decades, but we need to reflect on how we can really effectively and meaningfully make that integration. The Philippines will host the Loss and Damages Fund by the United Nations soon. And I think we need to strengthen the discourse on climate justice so we can make sure that global south countries, developing countries, including the Philippines, will receive enough and just reparation from the loss and damages they experience due to climate change. I just want to share in the next 2 minutes that because of our acknowledgement of the disparities in the climate change experience and discourse, we have engaged in action and community building. I have established Sphere Lab at De La Salle University. We call this Sustainability, Psychology, and Planetary Health Research Lab, a youth-focused group of scientists. I also make sure that I work directly with communities in partnership with private companies like health insurance. We provide, in the past 3 years, we constantly provide climate literacy and mental health literacy training for communities in the Philippines, low-lying islands, poor communities, farming communities, conflict areas. We also created a climate change and mental health community in the Philippines that is interdisciplinary, that is transdisciplinary. There's representation from the youth, from the community, from different disciplines, from the government, and even funders. And we reimagine the future of climate change and mental health in the country. I had the privilege of creating a diverse and inclusive group of climate experts and mental health experts that represent the 7 SDG regions of the world, and we created research and action agenda on climate change and mental health. I had the privilege to lead the East Asia and Southeastern Asia leg of this project. And if you want to read this work, we published our work on Nature journal Mental Health. And we are launching our journal that emphasize climate justice, inclusivity, diversity, and with prioritization on global south and young scholars. This is an upcoming journal by Wiley and supported by the British Psychological Society. And I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much.
John, thank you again for that incredibly insightful presentation. You've clearly laid out the powerful connection between our beliefs about climate justice and our willingness to act and support policies. It's fascinating to see the psychological mechanisms at play and particularly valuable to understand the nuances within the different global contexts, including here in the Philippines. Now we have time to delve deeper into specific aspects of your research and its implication. I would like to encourage everyone to share some of your questions and thoughts to Dr. Aruta. And in our chat box, we have a question from Dr. Raymond Tan. How strong is the empirical evidence on the correlation of climate policies and prevalent beliefs and attitudes?
Thank you, Professor Raymond. That's a very good question. If we talk about beliefs, there are many beliefs. What we know is that if we talk, for example, on political beliefs and ideologies, there's a strong correlation, and the evidence is quite clear that right-wing beliefs in the political dimension, for example, is negatively correlated with climate change policy support. Right? And it is worrying because we know around the world there's a rise of right-wing politics, and it is threatening climate change policies. We know the U.S. as an example, withdraw from Paris Agreement, and this is very much associated with right-wing political ideologies. There's a finding in the Netherlands that there's a weak relationship between climate change beliefs and support for policies and climate action. It was collected in 2023. The data was collected in 22-23, and that was also the time when the prime minister in the Netherlands, when there is a fast increase in right-wing political ideologies in the Netherlands, and in 2023, a right-wing leader, was elected prime minister. They stopped many of the national level climate policies. They have revived coal power plants in the Netherlands, and there's public support there. There's also weak evidence, not very consistent evidence on religious, and it really depends on the religious orientation of particular religious groups, but there's some mixed evidence there. But yes, beliefs are, can be dangerous from a psychological perspective.
So thank you, John, for that. We have another question here posted by Ms. Leia. How can we ensure that climate policies reflect the principles of climate justice?
Yeah, I think that's very important. Climate justice doesn't only talk about the disproportionate impact of climate change, that the poor and marginalized communities are impacted more. That's a reality. But also, these communities who are most affected do not have a seat at the table at high level discussions. So that's a problem too. There's a representational injustice as well in the climate domain. So I think we need to make sure that when we create policies or lobby for policies, there should be a meaningful inclusion of insights of those who are most vulnerable to the climate crisis, to the impacts of the climate crisis. How we ask the questions: are the voices of the young people included in this high-level discourse? Are indigenous peoples included here? Are people from developing countries really taking, you know, the the main role or leadership role in climate change policies? Now, there are efforts for sure. We know, for example, that IPCC author has been, the list of hundreds of authors in IPCC over the years have increasingly been more inclusive and diverse. So that's good news. But in terms of high level decision making, I think in many countries in the world, we can do more in terms of really making it truly inclusive and representative.
Okay, thank you, John. A message from Dr. Carmelita Quebenco, and she thanks you for your interesting and insightful presentation, as well as including young students in your action on climate change and mental health. A
Salamat
question
po.
by a question by Kevin Serrona. Have you looked at the impacts of physical infrastructures like landfills or power plants to host communities, and how climate or environmental justice is addressed in this regard?
Sorry, I want to understand the question and make sure I understand it. Is the question about,
So the
can someone
question,
clarify?
if you're able to look into some infrastructures, example of which are landfills or power plants, to host communities. Then,
Mhm.
and how they actually address those climate and environmental justice.
Mahirap na diskurso. It's a very difficult discourse in the Philippines. We know that it's very tied to, to politics. And for example, nuclear power plant in Bataan, has been causing climate injustice in the surrounding communities. It has been causing losses in terms of their livelihoods, in their health, and in their very cultural identity. I have actually friends who are environmental activists in Bataan, and I've heard firsthand stories. And so one of the initiatives we've been doing, I'm chairing the environmental psychology special interest group of the Psychological Association of the Philippines. And one of the projects we do is to provide mental health support to communities surrounding nuclear power plant in Bataan. And also these are communities that are affected by the reclamation in the area. Um, so the answer is yes. There are different forms of climate injustices. Even yung mga housing, yung mga villages, private villages that we rapidly build in the country, in many ways cause climate injustices because the people from low income communities who originally reside there, they're probably their ancestral lands, right? Are now pushed at the outskirts, and when disasters happen, they're actually the most vulnerable. So environmental justice, climate justice happens in many forms. We just need to pay attention to them.
Thank you, John. A question focused on indigenous people. This is from Jonathan Tiambao. So the question is there a study that involves indigenous people and their knowledge about climate change? Also, is there anything we can learn from them in terms of climate change mitigation and adoption?
Yes, I think it's a very good question. So the answer is yes and no. Yes, because there are already studies and even advocacies initiatives that not only include but elevates the perspective of indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have lived in harmony with nature, for millennia. And we can learn so much from them. So what I advocate in my work is how we can meaningfully learn from each other. Really, how can science learn from indigenous wisdoms and knowledges? Because definitely they have lived in harmony with nature with low cost, and there's so much that we can learn from them. Um, Unfortunately, their views at the moment and historically have been neglected or even pacified. That's also the reality. And yes, we can learn from them in terms of climate mitigation because they have practices and cultural wisdoms that we can definitely learn from. For example, the way we see ourselves in relation to the world relates to how we act pro-environmentally. Indigenous people often see themselves not as extractors of natural resources, but as protectors. They see themselves as a small part of the bigger scheme of things of nature rather than the center that controls everything around them. Indigenous wisdoms and perspectives definitely can teach us a lot about how we should look at ourselves. Rather than being very anthropocentric, like we are on the top of the food chain that can extract everything in nature, indigenous wisdoms can teach us a more ecocentric perspective of ourselves, that we are only one of the small species in the broader scheme of things in nature, and we should live in harmony with nature and everything else. And I think with that guidance, we can definitely learn so much at the level of policy making, interventions, climate mitigation, and even adaptation. There's more to say, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. I think that's all the questions that we have in our chat box. But I have one last question. And you mentioned about psychological perspective a while ago. And can you elaborate specific psychological mechanisms that explain why justice beliefs motivate climate action?
Thank you. That's a very good question. One is there are many mechanisms, but I like to highlight, for example, emotions. Emotions are very strong drivers of our action. And I want you to imagine when we talk about justice, it is an issue as well of fairness, right? And issue of violation of our ethical standards. So if someone violated your ethical standards, someone did something unjust to you, they elicit a very unique set of emotions. For example, anger is a moral emotion. You only experience anger when somebody steps on you or violates something. Guilt is a moral emotion. It's different from all other emotions because guilt is experienced when you feel like your action violated your moral standards. Shame is also a very unique emotion. Shame is an emotion that you experience when publicly your actions do not align with your values, and there's some publicity level to it. So all these emotions are in the moral domain that's very much related to justice. And these emotions, based on our study and many studies, is that it can be a pathway towards climate action and pro-environmental behavior. But that's an oversimplification. It's much more complex than that. There are many other psychological constructs that can really encourage climate change beliefs and action. But that's just one example I want to highlight.
So it seems that we have a lot of stimuli in the Philippines. We hope that we can refocus on this aspect on climate change mitigation. Okay, so all right,
Thank
everyone,
you.
let's bring our session to close. A huge thank you once again to our speaker, Dr. John Jamir Benson Aruta, for his insightful lecture on climate justice. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Aruta. Your research is incredibly important, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us for the engaging discussion. On the screen would be the QR code and link for your feedback so that we can further improve our delivery of this LaSalle Sustainability Lecture. We hope that this has given you much to think about, and we look forward next month on our next lecture. So with this, I'm again Aris Obando. I'm your host for this morning's event. So again, thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.